Alright guys, today I'm going to be walking you through my 4-piece Striker DPS build, and it's important to know that Striker is right now tied with the Hungry Hog as the highest single source damage boost in the game. It caps out at 100%. In my hands, this build is not necessarily going to theoretically achieve max potential, but someone with better aim is going to be able to utilize this build and the various mechanics to achieve ridiculous damage numbers, and that's why I've slapped it with the title of the hardest hitting build and the highest damage build in patch 1.6. The overall composition of the build is going to be 5 pieces of firearms gear, but due to your major attribute rolls and the various stat points on your mods, mainly your gear mods, this is not a glass cannon build. And actually a lot of players right now are starting to spread misinformation that running all firearms pieces or all electronics pieces is a glass cannon build. Due to the way that the major attributes work, especially with the scaling of health to stamina, this is not a glass cannon build. There's a specific reason why. You're actually getting a lot of main stat value out of your major attribute rolls. I'll go over that more in depth when I actually get to the pieces, but I would like to clarify this misinformation. Rolling 5 pieces of firearms does not make the build a glass cannon. It does not make the build squishy in any sense of the word if you roll properly, and that is something that needs to be laid to rest. Beginning with the chest piece, you are going to notice that I have rolled health as a major attribute, and this is where it comes into play when I talk about the scaling between stamina and health and toughness. Now, I have rolled firearms. You want as high a main stat roll as possible. That's a given and goes without saying. But for major attributes, I have chosen to go with skill, haste, and health. Now, health at 15,000 is equivalent to 1,000 main stat of stamina, simply from this one major attribute. So that's where we start to get into the value and how we're substituting stamina and keeping firearms while still maintaining a high toughness character that has a large base health pool. So for major attributes, I recommend skill, haste, and health so you can pop your booster shot more frequently. But if you do roll something like exotic damage resilience, that isn't going to hurt the build. For minor attributes, I would actually recommend having ammo capacity, but again, it's not going to be a major impacting factor on whether or not the build functions. Next up, we have our mask, and I'm opting to run the Tenacious talent, which has rapidly become one of my favorite talents overall in patch 1.6. This allows for 10% increased damage for 10 seconds when using a medkit, which is extremely powerful due to the various changes to medkits, which now heal you for less and are capable of being popped while at full health already without taking damage. This turns your medkit into an offensive tool, and I highly recommend it and popping it on the front end of fights before it even begins in order to get an advantage over enemy players. For major attributes, you want critical hit chance if you are opting to run an SMG as one of your gun types, but if not, I would run with something like skill power. And for minor attributes, you could run with a resistance, mainly shock or burn, but I found that damage to elites doesn't hurt at all. Next up, we have our Striker's knee pads. Now, on the knee pads, there's a little bit of flexibility, but the value of health as a major attribute is just too much to pass up. Again, this is equivalent to over 1,000 main stat of stamina, and this is where the value in survivability comes from, and this is why the build cannot be classified as a glass cannon, even though it seems like it on paper. Again, no one should be taking the meter stats that you see here at the top of the screen as gospel. Anyone that does not have an accurate grasp of how the division functions. There's a lot more things at play other than these stats, and you really should be paying attention to what your major attributes are and your character sheet in particular, because that's going to give you a lot more cues and indicators on whether or not your build is going to function. Now, I have rolled firearms again. Every single piece of the build is firearms. And for minor attributes, I have burn resistance, disorient resistance, and increased kill XP. I would very much prefer increased kill XP to be shock resistance. That is something that I find to be extremely valuable, especially in PvP, as the shocking status effect is really detrimental. It lasts a very long time, and you're very vulnerable during that stagnant state where you are standing still and capable of having headshots landed on you. Next up is our Striker's backpack underneath this awesome rainbow skin. What we have here is another situation where we've rolled health as a major attribute, which is creeping up towards that 1,000 main stat value of 15,000 main health as a major attribute. For minor attributes, you have ammo capacity. Again, we've rolled firearms, and that's a really good composition for the backpack. If you really want to turn it into a glass cannon build, you can run something like critical hit damage as a major attribute. However, I would highly recommend running health so you have a modicum of survivability, especially when face trading with your shotgun. Moving on down to the gloves, I have chosen to run the Savage talent, and I think that synergizes extremely well with the SMG that I'm using as my primary weapon. Again, I've rolled firearms, and then for major attributes, you want the perfect trinity of SMG damage, critical hit chance, and critical hit damage. However, since you are running a combination of an SMG and a shotgun with this version of the build, if you want to switch out critical hit chance for shotgun damage, there would be a tremendous amount of value in that. It's again user's preference. A lot of these different things can be switched out at will, and you will still be able to do tremendous amounts of damage due to the Striker gear set. You'll still be able to get kills, and if you use proper positioning and tactics, you'll be able to influence the outcome of the game. However, these major attributes do have a small impact on how well you can compete with similar builds. So a major attribute and switching out critical hit chance to shotgun damage may be warranted if you favor your shotgun in most engagements. Last up for our gear, we have the Striker's Holster, and this is a very straightforward item in pretty much any build. You want the highest possible main stats and health as a major attribute. There is a little bit of flexibility here though, because the health does roll lower than it does on other pieces, in the vicinity of 8,000 rather than about 15 to 16, which means that you can swap it out for skill haste or something else if you do highly prefer. However, I would recommend running health as the major attribute. For weapons, I've chosen to go with a Marine Super 90 and a Navy MP5N. This is because I believe the Super 90 has higher burst potential than the SASG, and then the Navy MP5N and the SMG archetype overall is something I greatly enjoy, and I've always liked crit builds. For the Marine Super 90 talents, I have Responsive, Brutal, and Competent. If you have something else like Unforgiving in the third slot, however, this is also going to be very powerful, though this is a great talent spread, and any combination of these talents or things like Unforgiving, things like Vicious, something like Fierce in the third slot, is going to have high damage output potential. Again, you really want to aim for Responsive though, Competent, and Unforgiving, as those three in any combination of 2 or more on a gun are going to be the optimal DPS spread. For the Navy MP5N, I have Deadly, Responsive, and Brutal, though I would much prefer to have Deadly, Responsive, and Competent and or Unforgiving, because again, Brutal is not something that's my strong suit. You know, landing those headshots is not where I excel. And that means that Striker isn't necessarily my best set. However, I thought I would put this out there and demonstrate as much as I can about the mechanics of the game for those that have better aim and can utilize the set to its higher potential. For all of my different gear mods, I have firearms with health as a secondary attribute, except for one, which is a stamina mod with health as a secondary attribute. The reason for this is to activate Responsive on both of my guns, and also to show that without normalization, I can still activate everything, and it does cross-perform in PvE. This is a tremendously powerful PvE build as well, though I will be demonstrating it in PvP. Also, since all of my different mods are rolled to health, that equates to about 15,000, again, raw health, which is equivalent to 1,000 main stat of stamina. This again factors into the build not being a glass cannon build. It actually is quite tanky considering the low amount of stamina that you have. This is the proper way to build in order to have maximum survivability as well as maximum damage. For all performance mods, run with First Aid Self-Heal, as this will give some value to your booster shot and actually keep you alive in a lot of circumstances. 6 times 4 is actually 24% increased heal from your booster shot, which is a large impacting factor, especially in PvP. So make sure to run 4 prototype performance mods that have 6% First Aid Self-Heal. Weapon mods are extremely straightforward. Mod with an extended mag on both guns, and then go for critical hit chance and critical hit damage wherever possible on every single one of your gun mods outside of that. For skills, everyone should be running Booster Shot due to the increased damage and damage mitigation. It is essential to the build. Outside of that though, there's room for customization. I am opting to run the Recon Pack due to its shorter cooldown over the other pulse modifiers, increased critical hit chance, and increased critical hit damage. However, it does not conceal you, so if you want to run something like the Scrambler Pulse, especially in PvP, that is also viable. Outside of that, if you're really in the mood for some cheese, you can run the Shock Turret. This synergizes extremely well with Striker. It actually immobilizes targets, you can stack up your Striker on them very efficiently, and you can melt them down in a fraction of a second with your shotgun, and also maintain higher Striker stacks for future engagements. This is a really powerful mod to run, and it is something that's considered extremely cheesy. However, it does synergize quite well. Outside of that, you can choose any skill that you want, but those are my 2 recommendations. For talents, this is my standard spread for Last Stand, utilizing Triage, Critical Save, Strike Back, and On the Move. However, if you are in a different environment, if you're in PvE, you can switch this up for things like Precision if you're not opting to run a Pulse, things like One is None if you do want to drastically increase your damage and that's all you care about, something like Steady Hands for entering cover and reducing weapon recoil. If you're using something other than an SMG, which has very high base stability, there's a lot of different options. If you really want to run something like Adrenaline, when you pop your medkit at full health, you'll still get some value if you're popping on the front end of fights, so there's a lot of flexibility here. If you are not in a squad, I recommend removing Triage and putting on something like Precision or One is None, but it's not essential. Also, a lot of value can be found in Tactical Advance. Increases to weapon percentage damage are extremely powerful in patch 1.6. Jumping into some gameplay, I've done my best to showcase the raw damage potential of the build, but it's important to know I may not necessarily be the best person to do so, as it does heavily hinge on your ability to land consecutive shots. But when you do, when you stack up that Striker bonus, you're able to achieve really high damage numbers, as you can see there, and drop players insanely fast. Another thing to know is that the shotgun reticle flinch right now, some people are calling it stagger, but I think that's an inaccurate description of what it is. The reticle flinch that makes your marker and your aim jump across the screen is very, very powerful and very, very annoying. if you go up in a 1v1 scenario and you actually land a couple of shotgun shots, they're not going to be able to out DPS you because they're going to be aiming at the sky by the time you're done hitting them. It is quite strong, though a lot of players do hate it. So in general, this may actually make some enemies when you run it, but it is a very strong build. Another thing to know is that Striker is theoretically one of the hardest hitting sets ever to exist in the game, and possibly always will be. You can achieve up to 100% increased damage from that one gear set alone. That's why I've slapped the title on there, because theoretically, if you stack everything, you have something like Tenacious for 10%, you have things like Competent for 10%, sometimes you have things like Unforgiving for 25%, you have Striker for upwards of 100% if you can get there or close to it. And all these things in tandem stacked together reach insane damage numbers. You can melt down enemy agents in about 3 shots, even when you're starting from 0 stacks. If you have something like 20 or 30 or 40 or even higher percent stacks, you'll be able to melt down enemy agents in 2 shots of a semi-automatic shotgun, which is really, really strong. It's one of my favorite builds to run, however, it does not mesh very well with my playstyle, and I get very frustrated with myself when I'm unable to get kills. I wasn't being very smart on my live stream when I was trying to gather this footage in particular. I do prefer my SMG over my shotgun. However, the shotgun and seeing the enemy character flinch is really, really fun. But I wasn't tactically being very aware of my surroundings. On my live stream, I struggled to get the footage, even though theoretically the build can actually out-damage every single thing I was encountering. There are very few other builds that can actually out-damage this one if you play properly. I just had a hard time. So it's important to know, guys, don't get frustrated. This does require practice, positioning, tactics, and overall, the one thing that it really requires the most is having aim, having a really good, sense of where to position your reticle to land the most consecutive shots, because the more you can do that, the better you get at that, the higher the damage cap is. This build actually has a high skill cap ceiling. If you are really good at landing your shots and you can land headshots, this build is actually unparalleled in the amount of damage that it can deal. So that's why I put the title there. Again, as you can see, you can stack up the Striker bonus in PvP and Last Stand very easily on the NPCs. If anything, that's what I feel like they exist for, is stacking bonuses and proccing various other mechanics. So you can stack up to like 30 or 40% very easily before some encounters, and then you can maintain those stacks through death again. So it's a very strong build, especially in the right hands. Now again, the reticle flinch, very strong, as you can see there. Not something I would want to run up against all the time. However, in the interest of being transparent in providing all the content that I can and the best content that I can, I figured I would showcase the build. That's going to wrap it up, guys. Hopefully I covered everything. If you have any questions, leave them in the comments below. As always, thank you for supporting the stream. Check out the links below if you want to support the channel or join Upper Echelon in any way. And as always, have a nice night.